Hi, good morning, everyone. I am a composer and not much of a morning person, but we will do our best here. Something else that I have also realized about myself as a human being and as an artist is that I am a maximalist. Very much a maximalist. Despite having a mostly all black wardrobe, I have a very maximalist brain and a very maximalist aesthetic in my living environment. So I'm going to choose to sort of subvert the topic of simplicity a little bit and the definition of simplicity here, because simplicity to me as an artist doesn't necessarily mean, creating a very minimalist house, like one of those very Zen houses where you only have white books with spines on a shelf and a perfectly organized coffee table. That is not my life. And I think trying to get to that spot for me would feel incredibly unnatural and not who I am as a person. For me, as an artist and a human being, some of the most complicated, anxiety laden moments in my life are the ones where I have a decision to make and I can't figure out where to go with that decision. I'm in a whole. Do you know the song by Devo, Freedom of Choice? Right? Freedom of choice is what we got. Freedom from choice is what we want, right? It references the dog who had two bones. He picked at one, he licked the other, he ran in circles, he dropped dead. Right. And sometimes, I feel this very strongly in my work as an artist, but I think it applies to a lot of us in whatever our careers are or whatever our daily thing is that we do. It can feel like we're making a million different decisions to the point where by the end of the day, sometimes I have such decision fatigue that my husband, Matt, will come home from work and say, "What do you want for dinner?" And I'll burst into tears and say, "Can you just give me something? Like, I don't even care if I don't like it. I just don't want to make that final decision," because that's this like complicating factor, right? You're like constantly thinking of this tree of what happens if I make this decision, what path is it going to send me on, and the tree gets bigger and bigger and bigger until you can't cope with it anymore. So I've realized in my life that sort of the interplay between complication and simplicity and dealing with that as an artist, I boil it down, I think, to knowing who I am as a maximalist, which is something I feel like, especially when I was younger, I was almost shamed for, like particularly in the 90s and early 2000s when minimalism was like all the rage in furniture design and all kinds of things. I felt almost shamed for being a maximalist. I feel like I got advice from my elders, my professors in college or whatever, also that I need to learn how to specialize in my field. I should make it simpler. I should not have so many interests. I should figure out exactly what it is I want to do and focus entirely upon that. I reject that. I reject that because there have been several points in my life, and one particular point which I'm going to talk about today and give you the story, where I have made a momentous decision that ended up being very, very simple. It vastly complicated my life, but at its core, the decision itself was very simple. And as I said, the decision making can often be, for me, the most complicated part of the process. I figured out a mantra for myself, if you like, about how to simplify decisions for me, especially big decisions. And the mantra for me is, how would you feel if you didn't try? If you're faced with a choice, how would you feel if you didn't try? Maybe not today or tomorrow, maybe in 5 years or 10 years. Like, really put yourself in that position looking back. If you didn't try to do this, if you didn't try to do the thing that you're deciding whether or not you should do, how would you feel? And maybe the answer is, I'd be fine. in which case, maybe you can let that decision go. Maybe that's the act of simplification that you need. But sometimes the answer is I would not be able to live with myself. I am pretty sure that if I don't make this decision now, even if it turns out really badly, I would very much more regret not trying to do this thing, going for whatever this is, even if it makes my life vastly more complicated, because I can imagine myself like on my deathbed thinking, there was this one time when I had this amazing opportunity and I let it go by, and I didn't do it. And for me, that is a process of simplification, even on really, really complicated life or creative decisions that I make. So, story time. I'm basically going to tell this story, which is a very abridged version of the podcast that my husband and I do together called the Bog House. Bog House is an 18th century slang term for a toilet. You will understand why as I get into the story. So, way back in 2014, my husband, who works in tech but does artistic performing artsy stuff on the side, and I were dreaming of one day moving from our very normal kind of half of a duplex that we lived in into finding some piece of real estate that we could use as a sort of live workspace. Really, we were into the idea of, there's been this movement of people doing living room concerts and things like that, a salon in your house where you could put on little shows. And we were always thinking like, wouldn't that be cool? Especially in a city like Philadelphia, which is gentrifying really rapidly. So all of the small venues where you can do experimental stuff are being closed down and turned into luxury apartments that are being bought by Russians from New York, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, no offense to any Russians from New York in the audience. And we were dreaming about it, and my husband was one night procrastinating going to bed, as creative people are wont to do. I'm sure this is why we're not morning people, right? By browsing Zillow, just window shopping on Zillow. And he spotted a listing for a studio apartment, 2,000 square feet and 3 bathrooms. Yeah, that's what he said. What? So he made the fatal decision to click on the listing and see what on earth this was, and discovered a listing for something that looked like a row home on the outside, but as he got into the real estate listing photos, it was very obviously a theater, a small performing arts space. He called me into the room because I do a lot of theater here in Philadelphia, and said, what is this? Do you know what this building is? What is going on? And I looked at it and said, I have no idea. Google the address. So we Googled the address and it came up, Grasso's Magic Theater. And I said, I don't know what that is. I've never heard of that before. Google Grasso's Magic Theater. I will abridge the story here, but let's just say Mr. Grasso went to jail, and it's such a Philly story. Mr. Grasso went to jail, and the theater had closed down and gone into foreclosure and gone onto the market. And it had been listed wrong, right? It's kind of like when you find one of those eBay listings where they spell the product name wrong, and so it's really a lot cheaper than it's supposed to be because they're not reaching the right buyers. Long story short, we stayed awake that whole night because I think we knew right from that moment that we were about to completely upend our lives and try to buy this property, which we weren't really in a financial position to do at the time, but we were like, this is not going to come up again, this kind of an opportunity. Just to give you an idea, this property is close to the corner of Front and Callowhill Street, so a couple blocks up from Dave & Buster's. It's like a 10-minute walk to the Liberty Bell. It's right on the border between Old City and Northern Liberties, and it was right on the cusp, you could tell, of like the real estate was going to go through the roof on this, but this was at a very affordable price that was just slightly over our budget. So long story short, after many months of negotiating and basically selling everything we owned, in February of 2015, we bought the property. On that day, a final day of closing, we had $7 in the bank, and everything else was a cashier's check that we were using to buy this property. It was maybe the wildest, riskiest decision I've ever made in my life. But also, as I said, the thought that if I didn't try to do this, I would be regretting this for the rest of my life. Like, this would be one of those things where people tell a story about real estate and you say, oh, one time I had this chance to do this thing and I let it go because I decided to play it safe, right? A year after that, our whole plan with the theater, it turned out to be this complete gut job, by the way. So we basically had to like take it down to the walls, and then we knew that we couldn't possibly afford to, have this building and another building that we lived in. We had to sort of live in this building somehow. So we managed to get a construction loan to build an apartment on top of where the theater would be. And we had to gut the theater completely, and we were sort of like, okay, we'll build an apartment first and we'll move into it, and then we'll figure out the theater thing after we found somewhere to live in the building. We got a construction loan and we started work on the building in 2016. We had to, in order to build an apartment on top of where this theater was, we had to install basically a big steel cage inside the structure, because as I'm sure you know, if you've ever looked at Philadelphia construction stories, we have an issue in this city with old row homes that have construction done to them, and then terrible, terrible things happen, like collapses and, buildings falling over on each other, and it's not a good scene. So we said, okay, the construction loan was getting bigger and bigger, but we're like, okay, we can handle it. Put this steel cage on the inside to support the weight of another level that we were adding onto this space. And in order to install that steel cage, we had to dig into the foundation of the building, these pits, to act as foundations for the steel structure. I am a pretty sort of DIY handy person. I really enjoy home renovation. I think part of it is because in my regular work as a composer, what I create is so non-corporeal and like it doesn't exist really, it exists in our brains only. Like there's sheet music, but that's not really it. It plays in the air and then it's gone, and it's just in our brains. And I really love the feeling of like drywalling a wall and thinking, that's solid, and even if nobody ever listens to my music again the moment I'm dead, this wall may outlive me. So I was hanging around on the construction site almost every day, getting in the way of the construction workers, trying to help and overseeing things and playing around in the dirt. And one day, I came to the construction site and they were digging these foundation pits inside the structure. And I noticed that in the piles of dirt coming out of these pits were things I wasn't expecting. Really old-looking wine bottles, like broken wine bottles, and little bits of pottery, like old-looking pottery. And let me see if I can work this clicker thing. Do I just advance it here? Oop, there we go. This is actually, I sent my husband into the site. I went to the site, I picked up an old bottle, and I took it home and Googled how to tell how old bottle is, I think, was the, I had no idea what I was doing. And the website that I found said that the bottle that I had found was probably pre-Civil War, which I thought was pretty dang cool. I was like, wow, that's really old. I had no idea. That's so old, that's super cool. So I sent my husband down to the site when he finished work, and he started picking up some of the pottery that he was finding in amongst all the dirt piles, and you can see he stuck it in a Wawa bag. I'm continuing with the Philadelphia theme here, and brought it home. And we didn't even know how to Google this stuff, right? This is the problem with researching something where you don't even know the terms to look for things, right? But we were very, very interested in it. Sidebar, when my husband and I were kids, separately, we both went through pretty heavy, like Indiana Jones, I'm gonna be an archaeologist when I grew up stages. Like our first overseas trip together as a married couple was to Egypt. So, I think we were primed really to be like, let's do archaeology. Can we pretend like, can I feed my inner 8-year-old who genuinely thought this is what I wanted to do for a living when I grew up? So we decided that we were going to investigate, and we discovered that one of the foundation pits inside bisected what my husband immediately recognized as 2 privy pits. Privy pits are toilet pits, right? So an outhouse has a pit that goes down into the earth, and old American outhouse pits are usually, it's a cylinder into the earth and it's lined with bricks. So he could tell, looking at this one construction pit, that there were 2 cylinders of bricks going down into the earth. And he said, I read about this, and a friend of mine up in Northern Liberties had a house with a privy in it, and this is what this is. So we went back to the site, and we looked at the privies in this construction pit, and we said, could we live with ourselves if we didn't investigate this? No, we cannot. I went down into the pit. Okay. Funny story, my husband put it through his back out. So it was mostly me going down into this pit and digging the entire thing out by myself, which was somewhat exhausting. I'm not a very physically strong person, but also this was a decision, again, I couldn't live with myself if I didn't make, right? You can see some of the artifacts that were coming out of this pit. I took them home to the house that we were living in while we waited for the construction to finish, cleaned them in my kitchen sink. We tried to contact some real archaeologists to see if they could give us some help, but it turns out archaeologists are really busy and underpaid people, and we couldn't find the right people to help us. So we sort of went, well, I guess we're on our own, so let's give it a go. This is what our house looks like now. So it turns out our 2 privy pits that we had were from the 18th century and were filled with artifacts from about 1760 through to 1840. Most of the artifacts actually date from around the period of the Revolutionary War, which is super duper exciting, right? After I had cleaned up all of these artifacts, I should mention I was trying to get my PhD at the time in music composition, but if you want to learn about a topic really, really quickly, the thing to do is to get a doctorate in any other topic, because your procrastination gears go into overdrive and you will do anything to avoid writing that dissertation, anything. So I learned how to research all of the deeds of my property, to dive into the history of my property. I learned how to clean sherd. I learned the word sherd, pot sherd. I learned all kinds of things, what the terms were for this kind of pottery, where it possibly came from. Cleaned it up, glued it together with museum glue, and posted pictures online. And this is when the archaeology community up and down the East Coast, who specializes in this kind of archaeology, kind of lost their minds about how cool our stuff was. I had assumed it was very ordinary, and that's why nobody was paying that much attention to it. But it turns out here in Philadelphia, our history, our material culture and history gets destroyed every day by construction projects because we have no teeth in our sort of preservation of what goes on, our historical artifacts and the history beneath our feet, which there is a lot of in this town. Anyway, this is just a small snapshot of our collection at this point. Our entire house has kind of been taken over by this archaeology. It was a wonderful boon during the pandemic, particularly because while everybody else was climbing the walls during lockdown, I said, I have 400 or 500 jigsaw puzzles that I have in my house to do. And they're really exciting jigsaw puzzles because it's not just a picture at the end of it, it's a pot that nobody's seen for 250 years, which is very cool. Here's just a couple of examples. These are photos taken by actual archaeologists down in colonial Williamsburg who were so excited by our stuff that they asked us to bring some of it down to be featured in a journal. This is a piece of Philadelphia-made redware, it's known as. Redware means it's made from the same kind of red clay that bricks are made of. And Philadelphia redware is a whole category. I love that it's a locally made product, probably made by German immigrants or people who come from a German potting tradition. And it's got this lovely sort of floral thing on it. It's about that big. There should be a scale on this picture, but yeah, about that big. It's a pretty big charger. Another Philadelphia-made product, this little plate, which I just thought was cool because it had this fun little slightly racist caricature of an Asian person on it here. It is a plate that was made by the Bonin & Morris factory, which was a small factory operation actually not too far from here. It was in operations kind of near where the old Swedes Church is, just up the road here. Between 1770 and 1772 is when it was open. And it's quite famous for being one of the very first American porcelain factories to specialize in making like British-style fancy goods, which was illegal at the time because the British refused to allow the colonies to manufacture their own goods, right? We were just supposed to ship them raw materials and then buy all of the goods from Britain with the taxes applied to them and the tariffs, right? This little piece here, this little tiny saucer, which is, about the size of a tea saucer, is the one that caused some archaeologists and historians and museum curators to like get in their cars and drive 5 hours to our house and send us messages saying that we had accidentally found objects of quote unquote national significance. It turns out Bonin & Morris, there are only 19 surviving pieces from the Bonin & Morris factory, and they are housed in places like, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, the Philadelphia Museum of Art here in town, the Boston Museum of Art. As my husband and I were just delighted that we finally had something that we could Google because we would never have found this before. But then when we typed this into Google, both of us were like, our blood ran cold. My first thought was, oh my God, I washed this in my kitchen sink with Dawn. Did I ruin it? Are the archaeology police gonna come and find me and arrest me for making a mistake? But I'm happy to say that the archaeology community has been so generous and wonderful to me and has actually congratulated me on doing a good job of cleaning these finds and putting them together and doing it in the best way possible, even considering the fact that I'm not a formally trained archaeologist. My PhD is in a completely different subject. This piece is one of those pieces that I read blogs by archaeologists and they literally say my dream would be to find some Bonin & Morris someday. I know, they hate me. They hate me so much. I'm so sorry, archaeologists. Turns out, little sneak peek, this hasn't been published anywhere yet. Since discovering these two privies on our property and going down this rabbit hole, we've become kind of the neighborhood go-to people for when another feature opens up on a property around us. So we have currently dug 6 privies on our block. We have the contents of 6 privies in our house. To give you an idea, these privies are usually between 5 or 8 feet in diameter and go anywhere between 6 feet down to, I think our deepest was 19.5 feet down. That's a lot of stuff. But the exciting news is that of those 6 privies, 4 of them have had fragments of Bonin & Morris pottery in them. So I literally have a box of like, here's my Bonin & Morris pottery. And that the exciting thing for me is this is rewriting the narrative of what this stuff is, because the previous historical narrative was this stuff was very rare and probably only for very, very rich people, and it's very, very fancy stuff. The Bonin & Morris stuff that we've found is for middle-class people, and it's not as fancy as the stuff in the Met Museum, but it tells a different story to the one that's currently in the history books and in only the way that archaeology can, right? Because you're literally just looking at objects and finding out information that was never written down. So that's really, really exciting to me. One more, I'm doing show and tell now, obviously. This is this bowl right here, which has an image of 2 birds copulating on a river on the front of it here. You can imagine what we immediately nicknamed this bowl when it came out of the ground, but I'll keep it PG. But you can imagine. So this bowl I was very excited about because of this neat little image on the outside. When we managed to piece together the entire bowl, or most of it, on the inside of this bowl was this weird little Caesar looking guy and the words DW forever. I'm very proud of my Google foo. I Googled DW forever, two birds copulating on a river bowl. And it came up with, and I was very shocked and delighted, a page on the website of the British Museum, little outfit over the pond. This bowl is one of a handful of surviving bowls. We've managed to sort of find evidence of maybe 7 other bowls like this, not exactly the same, but very similar. Was made in 1746 to commemorate the Battle of Culloden, at which the English troops beat the heck out of the Scots. Anyone who's watched Outlander will know more about this battle than others. But basically, it was the end of Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Jacobite Rebellion in England. This has sent me down on, I knew nothing about this battle, but I now know a whole lot about it, and in fact went to Culloden earlier this year to do more research on the battle and think about who could have used this bowl and brought it to Philadelphia and eventually left it in their toilet on my property. If you want more information about why people threw so much crockery and pottery and wine bottles and such into the toilet, I mean, you can ask a question afterward, but there is so much more information on our podcast. As you can tell, I'm super passionate about this topic now and could probably talk about it all day and then some. But one last thing that I wanted to get into, because like I said, is this simplicity? Oh my God, it's the opposite of simplicity in so many ways, right? What did I do? I complicated the heck out of my life. I took 2 years longer than I should have to do my PhD because I was so busy researching my property and this stuff. I would come to my dissertation meetings with my thesis advisor and the poor guy would say, "What have you done this week?" And I'd say, "I've discovered who owned my property in 1752. This is so exciting. And I've done this family tree. Check it out." And he's like, "Did you write any music? Because that's what I'm actually here to advise you on. This is interesting." But I'd say, "Nope." And he'd say, "Please come back when you've written some music." And I would then spend the next 6 months avoiding him like the plague. So I did take 2 years longer to get my PhD. My house went from a, pretty typical maximalist designed kind of workspace house to a house where I'm literally, for the first time in my life, getting rid of books because I need more space for Tupperware full of artifacts and bones and bits of rusted metal and just displaying all of those things on shelves that you saw in that earlier picture. But as a creative, I often talk about how artists don't really have hobbies. It all turns into your work eventually, right? So earlier this year, I had premiered an opera that I wrote for Oberlin Conservatory. It is an opera about archaeology. I think it's the first archaeology opera. I think it is the very first one that features archaeologists. And it is about 4 fictional grad school archaeologists who are excavating a property on Callowhill Street in Philadelphia, and who stumble across some artifacts and also a real-life story that I found when I was researching my property about a woman who died on my property in 1880. Her story captivated me because the police dismissed it as an accident, but she was found hanging upside down on the back fence of my property, strangled to death. And the police said she must have accidentally strangled herself by, yeah, I was... it took me a couple of reads, and then I went, "Oh, this is nonsense. This is nonsense." And then every time there was a strange creak in my house, I would say, "Oh, that's Alice. that's Alice. She needs me to fix this. So I wrote an opera about her, or about people trying to find out her story. To me, making these decisions it's simple to make this decision because you know you cannot live without it. And then it takes all of the need for courage or the worrying about risk out of it in some ways, because you just think, look, even if I try this and I fail, that would be better, right? So that's the end result of my wild archaeology simple decision that I made way back when. Any questions? Thank you.